So you get to watch the video about the separation of church and state in the United States. What are your thoughts after you watched that video? What was your immediate reaction?
Well, my immediate reaction was anger that people were doing this, and I felt that it was wrong for two reasons. First, there was the fact that they were simply removing references to God, references to biblical truth. And second was the fact that the way they did this was dishonest. They were distorting the facts of history. And so it was a lack of respect for the Christian faith, but it was also a lack of respect for history. And to think that a project which cost well over $600 million, as I recall, and enormously expensive, was shoddy, that a historian would look at this and say, this is not correct. And it was a disservice to what the country really is.
How do you think these subtle changes were able to make its way through?
I think it is a part of the negative influence of liberal academics, people who in their universities teach classes that are designed to distort American history. And there are people like Howard Zinn and others. There are people like Oliver Stone who have produced so-called documentaries that present a really negative image of American history. And in doing that, they diminish the sacrifices of people who fought for this country, people who were veterans of World War II, people who were veterans of Cold War conflicts. And it is a disturbing thing, because it is people within this country that want to educate young people to dislike this country. And if you dislike your country, it's a lot like disliking yourself, which in terms of psychology people recognize as a negative phenomenon. If you start the day by saying, you look in the mirror, I hate myself, you're not going to do well as an individual. And if we look at ourselves as a country and say, oh, we're awful, and we don't study the rest of the world, just as we talk about this notion of what it's like in another country on the other side of the world, we are unaware of the sufferings of those people, and it is an insult to other cultures and other countries when we denigrate ourselves and we don't take into account the experiences those people have had, which is not to say that the United States has not made mistakes. We've made mistakes, but other countries have done the same, and in most cases their mistakes have been of a much greater magnitude.
And what do you think, where do you think the country's headed in terms of separation of church and state with the new president in the White House?
Well, I think with the new president, because he's identified with liberty, he'll be here speaking at graduation. And while none of us thought of Donald Trump as an evangelical Christian, he does support basic American values, and one of those is the freedom to practice your religious faith. And in terms of what we have studied, there's a distortion of the concept of separation of church and state. And the initial focus of that was that the church should not be suppressed by the government. And we've turned it around now and said, well, in the name of separation of church and state, which is not exactly a constitutional provision, we're going to say that you can't pray in public. And I think the video referenced young people who, because they made a reference to God in a graduation speech, found themselves reprimanded. Excuse me. And I believe the documentary recounted stories of a young graduate from high school who was denied her graduation documents if she would not apologize for her insensitive reference to religion. And this is absolutely a distortion of what this country is about, freedom of religion. is not the same thing as freedom from religion, but the founding fathers were explicit in that there was not going to be a requirement for you to go to church, but by the same token, there was not going to be any effort to prevent you from going to church or from practicing your faith. And the church is under attack. There are efforts to eradicate not just the presence of religious references, but there are efforts to eradicate our history, which is the sort of thing that we justifiably criticized the Soviet Union for having done. And all of these are disturbing to us as Americans who look at the future of what our country can be, and ignoring the historical fact that this country would not have been created but for the influence of Christianity. And it is a requirement, frankly, for the citizenship in a free country that you have a spiritual faith, because if you don't have a spiritual faith that says thou shalt not steal or thou shalt not kill, then what will prevent people from stealing and killing except an oppressive state in which the government will have to enforce these things? If you have a Christian faith, then you don't steal from your neighbor. In the absence of that, then your neighbor has to spend, as frankly this country spends every year, millions upon millions of dollars simply to protect their stuff. And it becomes increasingly uneasy because we have no values, and it is our Christian faith that gives us the values by which we live.
How do you think Christian millennials should be approaching this issue? How is it significant to them, and how should they approach it?
Well, I think it is significant because it will shape their lives, it will shape their community, and I think their approach should be to demand of historians to simply tell the truth. And as you saw in the report, the video that we talked about, people were encouraged to call members of Congress to protest this, to show that as a Christian millennial that you are aware of our history, that you know the truth, and that you're willing to direct your representatives to live by that standard and not let ourselves be victimized by secularists who want to eradicate any religious references, just as the phrase "in God we trust," which is on most of our money. We see that increasingly pushed aside, as you saw in the video, the reference put on the rim of the coin instead of on the face of the coin, so it's very hard to read. Or the reference from the item on the top of the Washington Monument, which had a biblical reference, and so the display was turned around in the museum so you couldn't see the religious reference.
Dr. Bowers, thank you so much for spending time to talk to me.
Thank you very much.